What's the last line of the song you just heard? Is it Let Freedom Ring or God Save the Queen? It's both. Let's hear them in their proper forms, starting with the original form of the song. These two versions of the same song, one the most favored sonic representation of British royalty and the other a patriotic favorite in the United States, taken together allow us to see the connection between two big features of world history in the 19th century, nationalism and imperialism. The song that we in the United States know now as America, My Country, 'Tis of Thee, was derived from the British song God Save the King, which was first published in 1744. While the American song did not become the official U.S. national anthem, for many generations it served as an unofficial anthem and an important platform for expressing ideas about nationalism and citizenship in the United States. We typically associate My Country, 'Tis of Thee with patriotic themes celebrating democracy in the Americas and the nation's history of struggle for independence and freedom. The original song, however, was an ode to the British monarchy and loyalty to the crown. How did the same tune become a very different song? Different not just as songs with different words, but different in their meanings to people who sang them as proclamations of allegiance to different nations that espoused different political philosophies. We will see that the United States and the British Empire were indeed different, but they also shared some fundamental characteristics that became very common in the late 18th century and the 19th century. The song and its varied lyrics embodied the state of simultaneous similarity and difference. The history of the song itself reveals these sometimes complementary and sometimes contradictory forces of nationalism and imperialism. Okay, let's start with a key acknowledgement. Nations and nationalities do not exist naturally. We create both nations and ideas about nationality. Despite claims to the contrary, very few nations in the world today are made up of people who have always shared the same recent ancestors, languages, religions, food cultures, livelihoods, geographies, legal status, citizenship, and any number of the many things that we attribute to the term nationality. The United States is no different. The places that are now part of the United States have included peoples and cultures from the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia long before the creation of the United States and its expansion from the original 13 states. In many of the generations since its founding, we know that the definitions of citizenship, legal rights, and the status of belonging in the United States have expanded to include more and more people with diverse backgrounds. This was not predetermined or an automatic outcome of the creation of the nation-state called the United States of America. This was the product of innumerable hard-fought battles, including at least one actual war, to recreate the United States to include those who had been left out because of race, culture, and gender. This process happened because people introduced changes and revised their societies to reflect those changes. Also, this process happened in the United States because the United States grew a lot after its founding. As it grew, it incorporated places and people with varied backgrounds. This included people in lands claimed or conquered by the U.S. and people who came into the U.S. as it expanded geographically and demographically. So how do you create one nation out of many people? There are many ways, but one of the most common is to promote cultural practices that people can attach themselves to or participate in. These include symbols and holidays and that sort of thing. Flags have been especially potent symbols of nationalism. I didn't think much about it at first, but when I was thinking about the images I would use in conjunction with the anthems I played, my first thought was to use the flags of Great Britain and the United States. Why? It seems that few things evoke an awareness of national identity more than flags. These nationalist cultural practices also include songs, especially anthems. Many folks in the U.S. don't know that the U.S. didn't have a national anthem until 1931, when the Star-Spangled Banner was chosen. Up until then, however, America, My Country 'Tis of Thee, was something of an unofficial anthem that people sang at appropriate public events in much the same way as the anthem is performed today. The reason that it was passed over when a national anthem was selected was because of its British roots in the song God Save the King. Of course, the Star-Spangled Banner was an old song and used the same tune as another British song, although that song did not have the same cultural and political significance as God Save the King. Yet even at the time that the Star-Spangled Banner was selected, My Country 'Tis of Thee maintained an American cultural and political significance that the Star-Spangled Banner had not attained, and so it continued as a popular anthem for some time. The words that we think of when the song comes to mind were first performed in 1831 as written by Samuel Smith, but the song originated long before that. God Save the King was written and popularized during a period when the Protestant monarch of the United Kingdom was vulnerable to overthrow during the Austrian War of Succession. It quickly became very popular among those who supported the sitting king, the constitutional monarchy, and the British Empire. Note that in 7 lines, the word king is used 4 times, and the next to last line is long reign over us. The political philosophy of the song is quite clear, as it celebrated the power and protection provided by a strong monarch. Among those in the British Empire who embraced the song were Anglo-Protestant colonizers in the British North American colonies. They were overwhelmingly British in their political and cultural identities, such that there was no obvious American identity until the flare-ups in the several years before the War for Independence. Until this conflict, God Save the King remained a popular and cherished expression of loyalty to the head of the empire and British identity in general. Once the political and military hostilities began, however, Anglo-American rebels changed the words to create an oppositional identity, and as it turns out, to begin the process of creating a new national identity. Even in these times, many pro-rebellion colonials held conflicting ideas in which they opposed British policies, but retained affection and loyalty to the king himself. This would change during the war, but this shows that ideological shifts in the creation of new nations do not happen automatically and without complications. By the time this turn took hold, we find new words for the song such as this. Whereas Anglo-American colonizers once looked to the king as the protector of their rights, these lyrics reflected the idea that the king and the empire itself were enemies of freedom. Of course, we can't forget that a very large proportion of people in the American colonies remained loyal to the king and Britain during the war, and God Save the King with its original lyrics served as their anthem. But as we know, the rebels won the war and created the United States of America. It is interesting to note, though, that the song that welcomed George Washington to his inauguration as the first president of the United States retained the old tune with this opening stanza. This wasn't a hymn or anthem, though the occasion suggested that it might be perceived as one. It certainly celebrated the new nation, America, and its president, Washington, but it also showed that some old ideas weren't entirely replaced by a new ideology. The naming of Washington, followed by the line, with glory crowned evokes the notion of Washington as a new kind of king, as the word crown, in this case a verb not a noun, symbolized monarchical power. Of course, the U.S. was certainly not a monarchy, and the political ideologies behind the Constitution explicitly rejected monarchy as the basis for the government of the new nation-state. But old ideas about political power were not easily removed from popular culture, even as most embraced the new political philosophy. While the new Americans rejected monarchy as the basis of government, did they reject the notion of empire? They rejected membership in the British Empire, but as the history of the U.S. shows, the United States was from its founding an expansionist imperialist entity, first in North America and then in the late 19th century overseas. Early on, people embraced this idea. Indeed, one of the reasons for independence in the first place was to continue Anglo conquest and settlement west of the Appalachians, which the British home government opposed starting in the 1760s. Once again, the tune of God Save the King was outfitted with new words to reflect this vision for the new nation, as in the 1798 song Ode for the 4th of July, which included the lines at the end of a stanza, quote, "See a new empire rise, bursting with glad surprise tyrannic chains." So we see the song God Save the King rewritten and repurposed for the creation of a new nation with a new political culture, though it retained the affinity for empire. But an anti-monarchy political philosophy and love of empire weren't enough to create an American identity. In nationalist terms, a new identity required the creation of a shared history, even if that shared history had to be made up. We finally get the song to serve this purpose in Samuel Smith's 1831 version, America, My Country, 'Tis of Thee. Smith was a big advocate for music training in public schools, which were new and expanding during this era. He pitched his song as an ideal method for teaching music and cultivating loyal citizens among school children. It worked. Within a couple of generations, his version of the song became immensely popular as a patriotic expression, largely because it was part of the typical public school curriculum as public schooling became more common. Together, this song and public schooling served the purpose of inculcating notions about citizenship and proper behavior in addition to the basic content of education that we associate with reading, writing, and arithmetic. The U.S. was changing greatly in the 1830s and in the following decades as the evolving political system became more inclusive, the job market required more training and formal schooling, and the nation-state demanded increasing loyalty from diverse people, many of whom came as immigrants. These objectives were all the more important as the country experienced a second American Revolution, what we call the Civil War, in the middle of all of this. So all the tools of nationalism were used in overdrive during much of the 19th century, and America, My Country, 'Tis of Thee, was one of the leading components of this effort. The nationalist mythology and the verses written by Smith were clear. To be an American, a person needed to claim a very specific heritage, that of the Protestant English religious refugees who arrived in the 1600s. These were the real ancestors of the privileged few, but they were supposed to serve as the mythical ancestors of everyone in this young nation, regardless of the vast diversity in the biological, geographical, or cultural origins of the people who lived here. In this vision of America, the nation was not a melting pot in which the diversity of its inhabitants contributed to the creation of a vibrant mixture of people and ways of life. No, the citizen was or had to try to emulate a certain conception of a real American who was supposed to be white, Protestant, English-speaking, and of course a man. These ideas about citizenship and conformity were expressed in innumerable ways in the U.S. during this period, not just in this song. Within a few lines, these same thoughts were put on the lips of school children and their parents throughout the nation, contributing to the internalization of certain meanings about belonging in the United States. But there was more. The possessive word my featured in these opening lines could do something more than indoctrinate attachment and loyalty to the nation state. It could invite people to think on their own about who they were and what their nation was and was not. And people did this right away. Many African-descended people refused to sing the song as slavery continued to exist for 3 decades after Smith's version was first published and popularized. How could anyone sing about a sweet land of liberty when 1/5 of the people in the U.S. were enslaved? Black and white abolitionists agreed with this sentiment and made up dozens of other versions of the song to emphasize their disgust with the contradiction between slavery and freedom in the United States. But once slavery was ended as a legal status, this could change. We see this happen in an especially poignant example from a Union-controlled part of South Carolina on the night before the Emancipation Proclamation was to go into effect on January 1st, 1864. This account comes from Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who is portrayed in the painting of a Civil War battle seen earlier, and who was a colonel in the Union Army and commander of a regiment of African American soldiers. He recounted of that night the following: "The President's proclamation was read, and the colors were presented. All this was according to the program. Then followed an incident so simple, so touching, so utterly unexpected and startling that I can scarcely believe it on recalling. The very moment the speaker had ceased, and just as I took and raised the flag, which now for the first time meant anything to these poor people, there suddenly arose, close beside the platform, a strong male voice, but rather cracked and elderly, into which two women's voices instantly blended, singing, as if by impulse that could no more be repressed than the morning note of the song sparrow, 'My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing.' People looked at each other and then at us on the platform to see whence came this interruption. Firmly and irrepressibly the quavering voices sang on, verse after verse. Others of the people joined in, some whites on the platform began, but I motioned them to silence. I never heard anything so electric. It made all other words cheap. After it ended, tears were everywhere." So we see that people could and did identify with the national mythology Smith and others proposed, even if it meant embracing fictive ancestors and claiming a national history that did not acknowledge or reflect one's personal experience. Others who participated in protest or reform movements that proliferated in the 19th century did the same thing. Suffragists, temperance advocates, members of labor unions, and farmers' cooperatives came up with lyrical variations to criticize the idealized proclamations of "My country, 'tis of thee," and to express their hopes that the nation could change to embrace their perceptions of what would make the United States truly a sweet land of liberty. Of course, people did not necessarily agree on what this would be, and this song was at the center of the cultural battleground where various groups in the United States fought over the fundamental issues of nationalism and citizenship. This wasn't restricted to the 19th century either. The version of America played at the beginning of this lecture was performed by Marian Anderson at the Lincoln Memorial in 1939. Her performance there was set up because she was not allowed to give a concert in the segregated Constitutional Hall. So even after more than a century of Smith's song in American popular and political culture, some of the same kinds of issues about letting freedom ring in a sweet land of liberty had not yet been resolved. But one thing had been resolved. The song in the United States was no longer an anthem to the British monarch as it had been in the 1700s. It was truly an American song. A new nation formed from an empire had fully claimed its independent identity, and this song played an important role in that process. Of course, God Save the King continued to exist and became God Save the Queen when a female monarch occupied the throne of the United Kingdom, as was the case for most of the 19th century with Queen Victoria, who was pictured on the early slide. While many in the United States had a strange relationship with the identity of the growing U.S. as an empire, subjects in the British Empire had no equivocations about the identity of the empire as an empire. For some, it was celebrated, most notably with the performance of God Save the Queen as an anthem on 6 of the 7 continents during the greatest extent of the empire in the 19th and 20th centuries. For others, it was troubling. Those who were conquered by the English in the early stages of the empire, those conquered by the British in the second era of the empire, and those who were descendants of English colonizers in faraway lands, often had an uncomfortable or even hostile relationship to the song. The song represented the imposition of an empire on their sense of sovereignty, and the struggles for independence reflected this. Still, as the empire gave way to the Commonwealth and the formation of many new nations from old empires occurred in the 20th century, former British colonies retained God Save the Queen and had their own anthems. In all of these instances throughout the history of the song, we hear an echo of empire and the resonance of nationalism. So whether it's My Country 'Tis of Thee or God Save the Queen, the song that is both the same and different reminds us of the inextricably intertwined histories of empire and nationalism from the 18th century through the 20th century.